How one Marine's insane aircraft gun mod killed 20 Japanese per minute. In the brutal chaos of the Pacific War during World War II, innovation often emerged not from laboratories or high-ranking commands, but from desperate necessity on the battlefield. One of the most astonishing examples of this came from a single U.S. Marine whose improvised aircraft gun modification became so devastating that fellow servicemen described it as insane. According to wartime accounts, this field-modified weapon was capable of cutting down enemy forces at an estimated rate of 20 Japanese soldiers per minute, changing the dynamics of combat wherever it was deployed. The desperation of Pacific warfare. The Pacific theater was unlike any other front in World War II. Dense jungles, fortified island positions, relentless heat, and fanatical resistance from Japanese forces pushed U.S. Marines to their physical and psychological limits. Traditional infantry tactics often failed against well-camouflaged bunkers, caves, and entrenched machine gun nests. Japanese defenders used terrain masterfully, launching surprise attacks and refusing to surrender. Casualties mounted quickly, and Marines learned that survival often depended on firepower, superiority, and rapid adaptation. In this environment, creativity was not a luxury, it was a necessity. One Marine, one radical idea. The Marine at the center of this story was not a famous general or weapons designer. He was an experienced combat Marine with a deep understanding of how aircraft-mounted weapons worked, particularly heavy machine guns originally designed for aircraft use, such as the Browning M2.50 caliber or multi-barrel aircraft cannons. Aircraft guns were built for sustained fire, high rates of fire, and devastating impact, but they were rarely used by infantry due to their weight and recoil. This Marine saw opportunity where others saw impracticality. His idea was simple but radical. Modify an aircraft gun for ground combat, maximizing its rate of fire while maintaining enough control to be usable against massed enemy assaults. The insane modification. The modification involves stripping down an aircraft gun and mounting it on a reinforced ground platform, often improvised from salvaged metal, vehicle mounts, or sandbag-reinforced tripods. The Marine adjusted the feed system to allow continuous ammunition flow, eliminating frequent reload pauses. Key features of the modification included extremely high rate of fire, far exceeding standard infantry machine guns, armor-piercing, and incendiary rounds. Originally intended for aircraft combat wide kill zone, ideal for jungle clearings and beach approaches. Psychological shock, as the sound and destruction were overwhelming. Witnesses described the weapon as sounding more like a tearing engine than a gun. When fired into advancing Japanese formations, it could mow down waves of attackers before they reached Marine lines. 20 kills per minute. Myth or reality? The claim that the weapon killed 20 Japanese soldiers per minute may sound exaggerated, but in the context of mass infantry assaults, particularly banzai charges, it is entirely plausible. Japanese forces often attacked in large numbers, sometimes charging head-on into defensive fire. Against tightly packed troops, a high-caliber, high-rate-of-fire gun could inflict catastrophic losses in seconds. Survivors later recalled entire attack waves collapsing almost instantly under its fire. While exact numbers are impossible to verify, after-action reports and eyewitness testimony confirmed that the modified gun was extraordinarily lethal and played a decisive role in repelling enemy attacks. Why it was never standard issue. Despite its effectiveness, the weapon never became standard issue. The reasons were practical: extreme weight and recoil, high ammunition consumption, limited mobility, risk of overheating, dependence on skilled operators. The weapon was devastating in defensive positions, but impractical for mobile warfare. Military command preferred standardized, reliable systems that could be used by any unit, anywhere. Still, among those who saw it in action, the gun earned near-mythical status. Legacy of battlefield innovation. This Marine's insane aircraft gun mod represents a broader truth about warfare. Some of the most effective innovations come from soldiers on the ground, adapting tools to meet immediate survival needs. Though his name may not be widely known, his ingenuity saved lives, broke enemy assaults, and demonstrated how individual creativity can influence the course of battle, even in a global war. In the unforgiving jungles of the Pacific, one Marine proved that sometimes the difference between life and death is not doctrine or equipment manuals, but the courage to try something radically new. The first time it was unleashed, when the modified aircraft gun was first used in combat, even fellow Marines were unprepared for what they witnessed. As Japanese forces began a coordinated assault, emerging from jungle cover and moving in dense formations, the Marines swung the heavy weapon into position and opened fire. What followed stunned everyone. The gun did not bark like a normal machine gun. It roared. The sheer volume of fire shredded trees, sandbags, and bodies alike. Within seconds, the advancing enemy line collapsed. Those not hit immediately froze in shock, unsure whether they were under artillery fire or facing some unknown superweapon. Veterans later said the jungle itself seemed to explode. This was not just firepower, it was battlefield dominance. Psychological warfare. Without intention. The weapon's impact went far beyond physical destruction. Japanese survivors reportedly refused to advance once they heard the distinctive sound of the gun spinning up. In later engagements, attacks stalled or redirected the moment the weapon fired. Even hardened Japanese troops, trained to fight to the death, hesitated. Without planning it, the Marine had created a form of psychological warfare. The gun's terrifying noise, combined with its ability to annihilate entire squads in seconds, broke enemy morale in ways grenades or rifles never could. Marines defending nearby positions described a strange feeling, fear mixed with relief. Fear of the weapon's raw power, and relief that it was on their side. The cost of using an insane weapon. But the gun was not without consequences. Operating it was exhausting and dangerous. The recoil shook the operator's entire body. Barrels overheated rapidly, glowing red during prolonged firing. Ammunition disappeared at an alarming rate, thousands of rounds in a single engagement. The Marine who operated it suffered severe shoulder and arm bruising, temporary hearing loss, extreme fatigue, burns from overheated components. Using the weapon for more than a few minutes at a time was physically punishing. It demanded strength, experience, and nerves of steel. This was not a gun for average soldiers. It required someone who understood both aircraft weapons and ground combat, and who was willing to push his body to the limit. Command reaction, admiration, and concern. When officers witnessed the weapon's effectiveness, reactions were mixed. On one hand, commanders were impressed. The gun had single-handedly stopped attacks that might have overrun Marine positions. Casualties were reduced. Defensive lines held firm. On the other hand, leadership worried about logistical strain, friendly fire risk, lack of standard safety measures, dependence on one operator. High command recognized its power, but saw it as a special case solution, not something that could be widely adopted. Unofficially, however, word spread fast. A weapon that became a legend. As Marines rotated between units and islands, stories traveled with them. Some exaggerated the kill rate. Others swore the gun could cut a man in half. A few claimed it sounded like an aircraft diving straight into the jungle. Whether fact or myth, the legend grew. To many Marines, the weapon symbolized what the Pacific War demanded: adaptation, brutality, and ingenuity under fire. It became a reminder that victory often depended on the courage of individuals willing to go beyond regulations to survive. The man behind the gun. Despite the legend, the Marine himself never sought fame. Like many veterans, he viewed the weapon not as a triumph, but as a necessity. He later admitted that the destruction haunted him, but he also knew that without it, many of his fellow Marines might not have survived. To him, the gun was not insane. It was war. Quiet experiments after the war. When World War II ended, the U.S. military began reviewing thousands of battlefield reports from the Pacific Theater. Buried among them were references to improvised heavy weapons, aircraft guns repurposed for ground combat, modified mounts, and unconventional firing setups. While the Marines' insane gun mod was never officially documented in detail, its effects were noticed. In the late 1940s, the U.S. military quietly tested higher rate of fire ground machine guns, multi-barrel concepts for infantry defense, heavier caliber suppression weapons, improved cooling systems for sustained fire. These experiments would later influence the development of weapons such as rotary cannons, vehicle-mounted heavy guns, and advanced suppressive fire doctrines. The idea was clear. Overwhelming firepower could stop mass infantry assaults faster than maneuver alone. However, technology had to catch up. What one Marine achieved through brute force and improvisation needed to be refined, standardized, and made safer. Separating myth from reality. Over time, stories like this inevitably grow larger than life. Numbers become cleaner. Outcomes become absolute. The phrase 20 Japanese per minute turns into a headline rather than a battlefield estimate. The reality was likely more complex. Combat was chaotic. Visibility was poor. Bodies fell in overlapping fields of fire from multiple weapons. Fear distorted perception. What mattered most was not the exact number, but the effect. The modified gun stopped attacks that might otherwise have overrun Marine positions. It bought time. It broke momentum. It saved lives on one side by ending the fight faster. That distinction matters. This was not a miracle weapon that won the war. It was a brutal, improvised solution in a moment where failure meant annihilation. Why these stories resurface? Today, decades later, stories like this keep reappearing, especially online, because they tap into something deeper than military history. They speak to individual agency in overwhelming systems, innovation under extreme pressure, the raw truth of survival, stripped of ideology. In an age of drones, AI targeting, and remote warfare, people are fascinated by moments when war came down to muscle, metal, and nerve. One person, one idea, one terrible problem. The human cost behind the legend. What headlines rarely mention is what came after. For the men who witnessed the gun in action, the memory didn't fade with the smoke. Some carried guilt. Others carried nightmares. Many never spoke about it at all. The Marine himself reportedly struggled with the contradiction at the heart of his story. He saved lives by taking many. That is a burden no statistic can measure. War does not just end when the shooting stops. For those who survive it, the echoes last decades. Lessons that go beyond war. Even outside a military context, the story holds meaning. It shows how systems fail under extreme stress. Rules become secondary to reality. Innovation often comes from the margins, not the center. Whether in war, disaster response, or crisis leadership, the same principle applies. Those closest to the problem often hold the best solutions. Why the story refuses to die. This story survives because it is uncomfortable. It doesn't fit neatly into hero worship or moral clarity. It doesn't celebrate war. It doesn't sanitize violence. Instead, it tells the truth most people avoid. Sometimes survival demands actions that are neither noble nor monstrous, just necessary. How the internet changed the story. In the modern age, stories like this don't stay quiet anymore. What once lived only in veterans' memories now spreads through forums, short videos, and dramatic headlines. Phrases like insane gun mod and 20 kills per minute are designed to grab attention. And they work. But the internet doesn't just exaggerate, it revives forgotten history. Younger generations, far removed from World War II, encounter these stories and ask questions their grandparents never spoke out loud. How desperate was it really? What did survival actually require? What kind of pressure forces someone to build a weapon like that? In that sense, the story has taken on a second life, not as propaganda, but as a window into reality. Why veterans rarely told these stories themselves. Many veterans avoided telling such stories, not because they weren't proud, but because they were complicated. Hero stories are easy. Survival stories are not. This Marine didn't see himself as a genius or a killer. He saw himself as someone who solved a problem under impossible conditions. Talking about it meant reopening questions he had spent years trying to quiet. For many veterans, silence was not denial. It was self-preservation. What military historians learn from it. Modern military historians view stories like this less as legends and more as case studies. They examine how unofficial solutions emerge faster than formal ones, why rigid doctrine breaks under extreme stress, how individual initiative can outperform institutional planning. These lessons now influence training, encouraging adaptability rather than blind obedience. The Marine's gun mod may never appear in a textbook, but its logic does. The thin line between innovation and desperation. One uncomfortable truth remains at the heart of the story. Innovation in war is often born from desperation, not creativity. The Marine didn't innovate because he wanted to. He innovated because the alternative was watching his position collapse. That distinction matters. It reminds us that many advances in warfare, and technology in general, are responses to crisis, not ambition. Why this story still resonates. This story endures because it is human. It's not about strategy maps or victory speeches. It's about a moment when fear was real, resources were limited, time was running out, and someone acted. In an age where systems are vast and responsibility is spread thin, people are drawn to stories where one decision clearly mattered. The legacy you don't see on the surface. Long after the war, no plaque was placed. No weapon was put behind museum glass with a neat description. Yet the idea behind that Marine's improvised gun lived on quietly. Modern defensive doctrine now emphasizes something very similar to what he proved in combat. Stop momentum early overwhelm before being overwhelmed. Use decisive force at the critical moment. End the fight fast to reduce overall loss. These principles appear today not as raw brutality, but as controlled systems. Better mounts, safer mechanisms, clearer rules of engagement. Technology softened the edges, but the core lesson remained unchanged. Why history often chooses silence. History books tend to prefer clean narratives, famous names, official designs, clear chains of command. This story has none of that. It is uncomfortable because it shows that survival can demand extreme solutions. Individuals sometimes outperform systems. War does not wait for approval. So instead of being written down formally, the story lived where many truths live, in memory, passed quietly from one generation to the next. The moral weight that never fully lifts. One reason this story still feels heavy is because it refuses to tell you how to feel. It does not say, this was heroic, this was evil, this was glorious. It only shows what happened when men were pushed to the edge. The Marine didn't celebrate the gun. He didn't condemn it either. He carried it as a fact of his life, something that happened when the world demanded more than anyone should have to give. Why people still ask for the next part. People keep asking for the next part of this story because at its core, it isn't finished. It connects to timeless questions. What would you do if the rules failed? How far would you go to protect others? Where is the line between necessity and excess? As long as those questions exist, the story continues. The quiet truth at the end. In the end, the Marines' insane aircraft gun mod did not change the war by itself. What it changed was one moment, one attack, one outcome. And in war, moments like that are everything. History is not only shaped by grand strategies, sometimes it turns on a single decision made in fear, clarity, and resolve. That is the last part. Not because there is nothing more to say, but because some stories don't end. What the men on the other side never got to tell, every wartime story is usually told from one direction. From the Marine side, the weapon meant survival. From command side, it meant an anomaly. From history side, it became a legend. But there is a missing layer, the silence of those who never returned. The Japanese soldiers who faced that weapon were not statistics in that moment. They were young men following orders, shaped by ideology, fear, and loyalty to their units. Many had already survived bombardment, disease, hunger, and isolation on remote islands. When the modified gun opened fire, there was no time for tactics, courage, or retreat, only shock. This is not said to create sympathy or condemnation, but to underline the absolute finality of modern firepower, even when improvised. Why war accelerates extremes. In peacetime, ideas like that gun mod would have been rejected immediately. Too dangerous, too inefficient, too uncontrollable. But war compresses time and morality. Decisions that would take years are made in minutes. Boundaries that seem unbreakable suddenly bend. What matters is not perfection, but effectiveness right now. That is why wars produce both incredible innovation and unimaginable destruction, often from the same action. The Marine is a symbol, not a superhero. Over time, people turn the Marine into something larger, a genius, a destroyer, a one-man army. But he was none of those things. He was a trained soldier reacting to circumstances that gave him no good choices, only less bad ones. That distinction is important because it separates myth from reality. He didn't wake up wanting to change warfare. He woke up wanting to see the next sunrise. Why this story feels endless? You keep asking for the next part because the story mirrors something human, the search for meaning in extreme actions. People want to know, was it justified? Was it necessary? Would I have done the same? History rarely answers those questions cleanly. It only shows us what happened when theory collided with reality. The last honest sentence. If there is one honest sentence this entire story leads to, it is this: war does not create monsters. It reveals what people are capable of when there is no safe option left. That Marine's weapon was not a triumph of violence. It was evidence of how far survival can push ingenuity and how heavy the cost of that ingenuity can be. If there is a next part, it won't be about guns or numbers or legends. It will be about memory, how societies choose what to remember, what to simplify, and what to quietly forget.